On a humid summer evening in June 1983, Henry L. Blackwell was a man at the peak of his success, on paper at least. At 54 years old, he was one of Savannah's most respected real estate developers, known for his unflappable poise and shrewd business mind. To the public, he appeared the portrait of Southern respectability, a tailored suit, a well-maintained colonial home on Wilmington Island, and a wife of over 20 years, Eleanor M. Blackwell, who was always at his side. But behind that polished exterior lay a union that had long since soured. Eleanor, a quiet and graceful woman of 51, had once been Henry's steadfast partner. She was known among their circle as the devoted homemaker, content to manage their household and maintain the social rituals expected of a well-to-do couple. Yet by 1981, Eleanor had grown almost invisible to those who knew her, a woman whose presence at social functions was no longer required or even noticed. The couple had no children. Though no formal statement was ever made, those close to the family suspected this unspoken absence cast a shadow on their marriage. For Henry, whose focus was squarely on expanding his real estate empire, the childless home was merely a backdrop, another asset to manage, another facade to maintain. Their financial foundation was formidable. 3 residential properties, 2 commercial buildings, and a substantial portfolio of investments formed the backbone of their wealth. A prenuptial agreement signed in 1961 divided these assets equally in the event of divorce. But one clause was critical. If adultery was ever proven, the unfaithful party would forfeit everything. That provision had once seemed a remote safeguard, more an expression of family pride than a serious threat. All that changed in 1978 when Henry began an affair with Carla Vickers, a striking 27-year-old administrative assistant at his office. Carla was discreet and ambitious, a woman who knew how to navigate Henry's world without leaving obvious footprints. Their affair grew over the years from an indiscretion into a hidden dependency. By January 1983, Carla was pregnant, and Henry knew that if Eleanor ever found out, he would lose everything: his wealth, his name, and his carefully cultivated image. As Henry's personal crisis deepened, so did the cracks in his public demeanor. He became more withdrawn, occasionally uncharacteristically irritable. Some colleagues noticed, but no one suspected the full extent of his desperation. For Henry, the affair was no longer just a secret. It was a liability that threatened to destroy him. Meanwhile, Eleanor remained in the dark, tending to the rituals of her quiet life in their colonial home. To outsiders, the Blackwells still appeared to be the model of a successful Southern couple. 2 lives moving in quiet parallel, separated by secrets that neither of them would survive unscathed. Carla Vickers entered Henry L. Blackwell's life in 1978 as a temporary administrative assistant at his real estate office in downtown Savannah. She was 27 years old at the time, intelligent and striking, with a quiet self-assurance that made her stand out from the other staff. Carla had grown up in rural Georgia and moved to Savannah in search of greater opportunity. Her ambition and adaptability soon caught Henry's eye, and a professional rapport quickly turned into a discreet personal relationship. Their affair was carefully hidden. Henry provided Carla with a well-furnished apartment in Midtown Savannah, paid for in cash and leased under a relative's name. He was generous with gifts, designer handbags, jewelry, and occasional weekend getaways to Jacksonville and Atlanta under the pretense of business trips. Carla understood the stakes and had no interest in forcing Henry to leave his wife. She valued the security and lifestyle the relationship afforded her. By early 1983, Carla learned she was pregnant. She delayed telling Henry, aware of the chaos it might cause. When she finally disclosed the news in January 1983, it marked a turning point in their relationship. Carla later told investigators she believed Henry would leave his wife for her, but that hope quickly faded when she saw his reaction. Henry was immediately aware of the implications. If Eleanor discovered the affair, let alone the pregnancy, she would have grounds under the 1961 prenuptial agreement to claim everything they had built together. Henry's entire fortune, including the real estate empire he had spent decades constructing, would be lost in an instant. Divorce would mean financial ruin. Exposure of the affair would leave him with nothing. Henry's behavior in the months that followed grew increasingly erratic. He began avoiding social events he had once attended with Eleanor, citing work obligations that colleagues knew were fabrications. At the office, he appeared preoccupied, often staring off into the distance or losing track of conversations. Trusted business partners noticed his normally precise demeanor fraying at the edges. Eleanor, for her part, remained oblivious to the affair. She continued her quiet routines, maintaining the home and preparing meals for Henry's increasingly irregular schedule. Friends described her as more withdrawn than ever, a woman who had learned to endure long silences and empty evenings without question. Eleanor's world had grown smaller, but she clung to the belief that her marriage was secure, even if it was no longer affectionate. In this fragile balance, Carla's pregnancy loomed like a hidden storm. Henry took to making frequent trips out of town, always with vague explanations. He was seen several times in Jacksonville, Florida, though he claimed it was purely for business. In truth, he was there meeting with Dennis C. Booker, a former construction foreman with a reputation for handling problems outside the law. During these clandestine meetings, Henry made it clear to Booker that he was desperate. He spoke in carefully measured phrases, but left no doubt about his intentions. Eleanor could never learn the truth, and he would not lose everything he had worked for. Booker, who had known Henry from past business dealings, saw an opportunity for profit and agreed to provide a solution, one that would eliminate the threat Eleanor posed without exposing Henry's affair. The arrangement was cold and transactional. Henry offered $25,000, half up front and half upon completion. Booker accepted without hesitation. Henry's instructions were explicit. Eleanor's death must appear accidental or the result of a burglary. She could never know why, and there could be no direct connection to Henry. Throughout the spring of 1983, Henry maintained his outward composure. To those who knew him only as a successful businessman, there were no signs of the lethal plan taking shape behind the scenes. But in his private moments, the weight of what he had set in motion was unmistakable. He had chosen a path that could never be undone, a decision that would forever seal his fate and that of everyone he claimed to care for. By late April 1983, Henry L. Blackwell was no longer merely a man with a secret. He was a man driven by fear, fear of exposure, fear of ruin, and most of all, fear of losing the empire he had spent his life building. The pregnancy of his mistress, Carla Vickers, was a complication that threatened to shatter everything he had worked for. In his mind, the only path forward was a permanent solution, one that would erase the threat altogether. It was in this atmosphere of desperation that Henry made the decision to have his wife killed. The idea did not come to him suddenly. Rather, it emerged over weeks of sleepless nights and anxious pacing in the confines of his downtown office. Divorce was impossible. If Eleanor discovered his infidelity, she would take everything under the punitive clause of their 1961 prenuptial agreement. Exposure meant personal and financial annihilation. To Henry, who had spent decades defining himself by wealth and control, this was unthinkable. Dennis C. Booker was an unlikely accomplice. He had once been a construction foreman in one of Henry's early development projects in the late 1960s. Their paths had diverged after that project ended. Henry moved on to bigger ventures, while Booker fell into a life of petty crime and associations with criminal elements. By 1983, Booker was known among Savannah's underbelly as a man who could get things done for the right price. He had a reputation for reliability in unsavory tasks, intimidation, debt collection, and, on at least one whispered occasion, contract killing. Henry approached Booker through a mutual acquaintance in Jacksonville, a city large enough to ensure discretion. Their first meeting took place in a dimly lit warehouse on the city's industrial fringe. Henry arrived alone, dressed in his usual tailored suit, but his composure was visibly frayed. Booker, stocky and sunburned from years of outdoor labor, listened in silence as Henry outlined what he wanted. Henry did not use the word murder that night. Instead, he spoke of needing a final solution, of how she can't ever know, and of how it has to be done cleanly. Booker, who had heard such language before, understood perfectly. The terms were quickly agreed upon. $25,000 in total, half up front, half upon completion. Booker would ensure Eleanor's death appeared accidental or the result of a burglary. There would be no direct link back to Henry. In the following weeks, Henry provided Booker with precise information about Eleanor's routines. He described her daily habits, how she spent her mornings tending the garden, her evenings preparing dinner, and how she almost never left the house alone after dusk. He gave Booker a set of keys, explaining that he would leave the side door of their colonial home unlocked on the chosen night. The level of detail in Henry's instructions betrayed a chilling determination. Henry's demeanor in this period was outwardly unchanged. At work, he remained the deliberate and confident developer, signing contracts and reviewing plans with his usual thoroughness. But in private, he was increasingly consumed by the thought of what he had set in motion. Carla, for her part, remained unaware of the plan. She believed Henry would find a way to leave his wife and start a new life with her and their unborn child. She did not know that Henry had already decided the only way forward involved bloodshed. As the chosen date approached, Henry and Booker spoke only in person, never over the phone. The final meeting took place on the night of June 6, 1983. Henry handed over the first installment of cash in a plain brown envelope, $12,500 in bundled bills withdrawn from a personal account. Booker took the money without a word. The arrangement was now sealed. In the days that followed, Henry maintained his outward calm. To colleagues and neighbors, he was the same man he had always been, composed, courteous, and in control. But beneath the surface, the man who once relied on contracts and legal papers to keep his world in order had crossed a line that would soon engulf him in consequences beyond his careful calculations. On the evening of June 9, 1983, the plan Henry L. Blackwell had meticulously arranged with Dennis C. Booker was set in motion. The day had been warm and humid, typical of Savannah in early summer, and a light rain fell in the late afternoon. As night settled in, Eleanor Blackwell prepared dinner alone in the kitchen of their stately colonial home on Wilmington Island. Henry had made sure to be absent, telling Eleanor he needed to finalize business documents downtown. He left their home shortly before 6 p.m., his demeanor calm and deliberate. As arranged, he left the side door unlocked, a crucial detail to ensure Booker's silent entry. At approximately 9:15 p.m., Booker entered the residence. He wore dark clothing, gloves, and carried a length of galvanized steel pipe wrapped in cloth to muffle any sound. Eleanor was in the kitchen, her back turned as she chopped vegetables at the counter. Booker approached her from behind and struck her once on the left side of the skull with the pipe. The blow rendered her unconscious instantly. Booker then used an electrical cord, taken from a nearby lamp, to strangle Eleanor until she was dead. The ligature left deep bruises on her neck, consistent with manual and ligature compression. The murder itself was quick, efficient, and devoid of any warning, just as Henry had demanded. To disguise the killing as a burglary, Booker staged the scene with calculated care. He rifled through drawers in the study, scattering papers and tipping over a small jewelry box. He forced open the couple's safe in the master bedroom, using a crowbar, taking a modest amount of jewelry and cash. Yet many of Eleanor's most valuable possessions remained untouched, a detail that would later draw suspicion. Booker exited the house by the same side door, slipping back into the warm night air. No neighbors reported seeing any unfamiliar vehicles or hearing any disturbance. Savannah's rain-dampened streets absorbed the faint sounds of the crime. At 11:23 p.m., Henry returned home. He found Eleanor's lifeless body lying on the kitchen floor, her face turned away. He called the Chatham County Sheriff's Department at 11:32 p.m., his voice controlled but tense. He reported a break-in, a possible burglary gone wrong, and his wife's death. Deputies arrived within minutes. The scene was quickly secured, and investigators noted the superficial nature of the ransacking. There was no sign of forced entry at any door or window, no muddy footprints or disturbances in the rain-soaked flower beds outside. Eleanor's body bore the telltale marks of manual and ligature strangulation, and the blunt force trauma to her head was immediately evident. The initial appearance of a burglary was unconvincing to the detectives on scene. While Henry recounted the night's events with practiced calm, the inconsistencies in the apparent motive and the precise nature of the attack raised immediate questions. Henry's carefully crafted narrative was beginning to show cracks that would soon unravel the truth behind the death of Eleanor M. Blackwell. Deputies from the Chatham County Sheriff's Department secured the Blackwell residence in the early hours of June 10, 1983. The initial visual assessment of the scene raised immediate doubts about the supposed burglary. Although the safe in the master bedroom had been forced open and a few drawers were in disarray, the rest of the house was undisturbed. Jewelry of substantial value remained untouched in the bedroom dresser, and Eleanor's handbag, containing both cash and credit cards, sat undisturbed on the hall table. The absence of forced entry at any of the doors or windows only deepened the suspicions of investigating deputies. In interviews conducted the following morning, Henry Blackwell stated he had been working late at his downtown office and arrived home around 11:23 p.m. to find Eleanor already dead. His demeanor was calm and cooperative, though his answers were notably precise and rehearsed. Deputies noted no visible signs of forced emotion or confusion, an unusual reaction for a husband finding his spouse murdered. Eleanor's autopsy confirmed ligature strangulation as the primary cause of death, with associated blunt force trauma to the left temporal region. The medical examiner concluded she had died sometime between 9 p.m. and 10 p.m. Eleanor's defensive wounds were minimal. Her fingernails were intact, suggesting she never saw her attacker or had time to react. The Blackwell residence had been subjected to an unusually heavy rainfall that evening, making it unlikely that an intruder could approach unnoticed without leaving tracks. Yet no footprints or fresh tire impressions were found near the house, suggesting the perpetrator either had advanced knowledge of the residence or was already known to the victim. Detectives conducted interviews with neighbors who reported nothing unusual. No suspicious vehicles, no raised voices or sounds of struggle. Eleanor had last been seen earlier that afternoon working in her garden, calm and composed, with no sign that she was aware of any imminent danger. Attention quickly shifted to Henry's financial status and marriage history. Investigators learned of the 1961 prenuptial agreement, which included the infidelity clause. Although no direct evidence of an affair was immediately uncovered, the clause's existence introduced the possibility of a financial motive. By early July 1983, investigators were discreetly probing Henry's personal life. Rumors of his relationship with Carla Vickers, while not yet substantiated, reached the ears of detectives who began quietly checking local addresses linked to Henry. Carla's name surfaced as a potential mistress, but without direct evidence or corroboration, the lead was kept confidential pending further developments. Meanwhile, Eleanor's funeral on June 15, 1983, was a somber affair, attended by Savannah's elite and close family friends. Henry played the role of grieving husband convincingly, accepting condolences, standing stoically at the graveside, and maintaining the outward composure that had defined his public persona. But the seeds of doubt had already been sown in the minds of the investigators assigned to the case. They saw through the polished image, noting the careful control in Henry's responses and the methodical calm he exhibited in the aftermath of his wife's violent death. As the investigation unfolded, these early suspicions would prove critical in unraveling the truth behind Eleanor Blackwell's final hours and the man who had engineered her murder from the shadows. By late July 1983, the investigation into Eleanor Blackwell's death had reached an impasse. Although the scene's staged appearance and the lack of forced entry had aroused suspicion, no direct evidence yet linked Henry Blackwell to the crime. Witness statements offered no observations of suspicious vehicles or intruders that night, and Henry's carefully managed public persona made it difficult to pierce his outward calm. That changed when detectives received an anonymous tip on July 28, 1983. The caller, who refused to give a name, claimed that Dennis C. Booker, an ex-construction foreman with a reputation for under-the-table work, had recently boasted about taking care of a problem for a wealthy man in Savannah. The tip was enough to prompt a closer look at Booker, who was known to law enforcement for minor charges and suspected involvement in organized criminal activities. Surveillance was initiated on Booker, focusing on his known associates and financial transactions. It quickly became clear that Booker's lifestyle had recently changed. He was observed driving a newly acquired Chevrolet Impala, paying off a substantial gambling debt in cash, and frequenting establishments beyond his typical means. Investigators confirmed that Booker had no legitimate income source that would explain this sudden influx of money. A search warrant was secured for Booker's residence on August 3, 1983. During the search, deputies found $12,500 in bundled cash stored in a metal toolbox in Booker's garage. Serial numbers on the bills matched a withdrawal Henry Blackwell had made from a personal account 2 weeks before Eleanor's murder, an account that Eleanor did not have access to and that Henry used for personal expenses beyond his wife's knowledge. Confronted with this evidence, Booker was taken into custody on August 5, 1983. In his initial interviews, he denied any involvement in Eleanor's death. However, faced with the undeniable link between the cash and Henry Blackwell's account, Booker eventually confessed. His statement was detailed and precise. Henry had approached him in April 1983, offering $25,000 to murder his wife and make it appear as a burglary. Booker admitted to receiving half of the money up front and described how Henry had provided keys and specific instructions about Eleanor's routines. Booker's confession also revealed Henry's calculated efforts to distance himself from the crime. He recounted how Henry had stressed the importance of making the death look accidental or as a random act of violence. Booker's description of the scene, the murder weapon, and the time frame matched the autopsy report and the evidence gathered from the Blackwell home, further corroborating his account. On August 18, 1983, with Booker's confession in hand, authorities moved to arrest Henry Blackwell at his office in downtown Savannah. Henry offered no resistance as deputies took him into custody. In the interrogation room, he maintained his innocence, denying any involvement with Booker and claiming he was being framed. His answers were clipped and carefully measured, but the mounting evidence was undeniable. Financial records showed the withdrawal from his personal account. Telephone logs documented multiple calls to Booker's known haunts in Jacksonville, and Booker's confession, detailed and unwavering, tied every piece of the plan together. Forensic analysis of the safe's forced entry further supported the theory that the burglary had been staged, an act consistent with Booker's description of Henry's instructions. The final pieces of the puzzle fell into place when Carla Vickers, under pressure from investigators, admitted her relationship with Henry and her pregnancy. She disclosed that Henry had grown increasingly distant and anxious in the months before the murder, and that he had warned her repeatedly never to contact Eleanor. Carla's statement added another layer to the prosecution's case, establishing a clear motive rooted in Henry's fear of losing his wealth and his public reputation. With Henry Blackwell now formally charged with first-degree murder and conspiracy to commit murder, the investigation entered its final phase. What began as a seemingly straightforward burglary had been exposed as a carefully orchestrated contract killing, engineered by a man whose carefully constructed life was built on secrets that had finally come undone. Henry L. Blackwell's arrest on August 18, 1983, marked the culmination of months of methodical investigation. He was charged with first-degree murder and conspiracy to commit murder. In the days that followed, as his name appeared on front pages across Savannah, Henry maintained an unshakable calm, denying any involvement and insisting that Dennis Booker was a liar seeking to save himself. But the evidence was too compelling. In December 1983, Henry's trial opened in the Chatham County Courthouse. Prosecutors presented Booker's detailed confession, the cash matching Henry's personal withdrawal, and testimony from Carla Vickers, revealing her affair and pregnancy. Neighbors and colleagues testified to Henry's increasingly secretive and agitated behavior in the months before Eleanor's murder. Forensic specialists confirmed the staged nature of the burglary, the forced safe entry that looked more like an afterthought than a genuine theft. Henry's defense team, led by a prominent local attorney, argued that Booker had acted independently to extort money from Henry. They portrayed Henry as a victim of Booker's greed and manipulation. But jurors were unconvinced by this narrative, especially in the face of Carla's account and the direct financial link to the murder-for-hire payment. On January 10, 1984, after just 8 hours of deliberation, the jury returned a unanimous verdict: guilty on all counts. Henry L. Blackwell was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. The aftermath of the trial was marked by quiet scandal and public fascination. Savannah's social circles, which had once revered Henry as a pillar of respectability, now viewed him as a cautionary tale of ambition gone astray. Eleanor Blackwell was buried in her family's Charleston plot, her name now a solemn reminder of the high cost of betrayal. For Carla Vickers, The birth of her child in February 1984 was overshadowed by the knowledge that the father would never be free. She cooperated fully with prosecutors, providing key details that helped solidify the case. She never publicly commented again on her relationship with Henry, moving away from Savannah shortly after the trial ended. Dennis Booker, the hired killer, received a life sentence as part of a plea agreement in exchange for his testimony. He was transferred to a state penitentiary in Reidsville, Georgia, where he remains incarcerated. Henry Blackwell spent the remainder of his life in the Georgia state prison system. He died in 1997 from heart failure, leaving behind an empire that had once seemed unshakable, now fractured by greed, secrecy, and the lethal weight of his own decisions. The case of Henry and Eleanor Blackwell remains a stark example of how a marriage's hidden fractures can spiral into deadly consequence, and how even the most carefully guarded secrets will eventually come to light.